Hello everyone, today I want to talk about mana curves in Canadian Highlander. Most people know the basic concepts of a mana curve, but there's a lot of nuance to it that can really help you elevate your deck building and just sort of give you some extra theory to use for designing your own decks. Like most of my theory videos, I'm going to have a bunch of resources that I will link in the description, and there will be chapters so you can jump around if you need to. With that said, let's get started. So first, let's talk about our agenda for today. Today, I'm going to talk about what a mana curve is and why you should care about it. Then I want to talk about what I call mana advantage and understanding what mana advantage is and the different methods for maximizing that advantage. Then I want to talk about the shapes that mana curves tend to come up in, the normal shapes that you usually see. Then I want to analyze some mana curves of winning decks in Canadian Highlander. And then I want to briefly touch on what acceleration, cantrips, mana sinks, and utility lands do to your mana curve. That's a very deep topic that could go, it could be a video unto itself, so I just want to talk about it quickly. But it is important because it affects your mana curve. And then I'm going to recap and, talk about my conclusions. So first, what is a mana curve? A mana curve is basically created by arranging all of your cards according to their mana cost, their CMC, and lining them up next to each other in sort of a grid format. If you're on Moxfield, Moxfield generates these types of grids for you, so you can have bar graphs 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And if you draw a line over it, it creates a curve, and that's just the mana curve. The purpose of having a mana curve is to maximize the amount of mana that you spend over the course of the game so that you don't leave any mana hanging. As a diagnosis tool, mana curve is useful for optimizing your deck and streamlining your play experience, and as a theoretical tool, it's really useful for constructing mana bases. If you know what your curve is, you know how many lands you need, and for illustrating the best way to maximize mana advantage over the course of the game. This is a term that I don't think I've seen anyone else use, but it's been referenced to, and so I'm sort of coining it, and I'll talk about it in a second. Knowing how mana curves work help you with deck building and your own play patterns, and they can also help you with understanding your opponent's deck's play patterns, because if you know what your opponent's deck's curve looks like, you kind of know how their deck will play, like what normal play patterns you'll see. I'm going to be referencing a bunch of concepts from different articles. This article, Mana Curve by Mike Flores, has a very good illustration of the importance of the mana curve. And some of these things, like from Frank Karsten and from Oscar Tan, have some very useful concepts if you're interested in learning more about mana curves, just in Constructed, Commander, etc. Okay, so let's talk about mana advantage. So the idea about mana advantage is that permanents that are in play generate their value in terms of CMC every single turn that they're active. So a Goblin Guide on turn 1 acts as if it's a 1-mana spell. But then if it's been around for 2 turns, so a Goblin Guide that was played on turn 1 and is around for turn 2, contributes its mana value again. So it's basically like it acted like it gave you 2 mana worth of value. If it's been around for 3 turns, it's giving you 3 mana worth of value. Something like an On-Crop Crasher is generating 3 mana value per turn. So the idea is that if you play your early drops early on, they can act as if they are much larger drops. So a Goblin Guide on turn 1 that lasts for 3 turns is roughly equivalent to a 3-drop that is played on turn 3. And if you've got a perfect hand like this one here, your curve is quite good, honestly. You curve Goblin Guide into Bloodthirsty Adversary into On-Crop Crasher with a backup Fire Blast. And the idea is that every single turn, you're using all of the mana that you can generate, because you're going to play 1 mountain on turn 1, a second mountain on turn 2, a third mountain on turn 3. So no mana is wasted, and all of your threats are generating value, as much value as they can over time. Obviously, if you drew your Goblin Guide on turn 4 or turn 5, your Goblin Guide is not going to be very useful because it's not going to contribute much. It's just a 1-drop on turn 4 or 5. It's not very helpful. But if you get it down early, you can maximize the value of your mana. If you've got an uneven curve, like a lot of 2s and 3s, you might have a hand that looks like this one down here with 3 mountains, 2 2-drops, and 2 3-drops. This means that you're not going to spend anything on turn 1, which means you're quote-unquote wasting the first mana, and then turn 2 you're going to play something, turn 3 you're going to play something, and then turn 4, assuming you didn't draw any more cards, this is just assuming you only have these cards, you can't fit Rada's Firebrand and Exquisite Firecraft into 4 mana. So the idea is that you want to be playing cards, you want to be using all the mana that you can every single turn of the game, because that's how you accrue the most value over the course of the game. Generally, the person who's able to spend the most mana means that they've cast the most spells, which means they've gotten the most effects, which means that they're winning. Another way to look at mana advantage is the ability to multi-spell. So cheaper spells are a lot easier to combine together to fit the amount of mana that you produce in a turn than more expensive spells are. So smaller spells can basically fill holes in your curve. If you've got a bunch of 1-drops and 2-drops, those can fit turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, etc. But if you've got a bunch of 2-drops, it might be hard to sequence everything. So, if we look at this first hand, it's Volcanic Island, Underground Sea, Island, Fatal Push, Orcish Bowmasters, Mana Leak, Opt. Turn 1, you can play either Fatal Push or Opt. So you've got a flexibility in your turn 1 play. Turn 2, you can play Orcish Bowmasters or Mana Leak. That's flexibility in your turn 2 play. And then turn 3, you still are going to have a combination of a 1-drop and a 2-drop. And this makes it very flexible, and you're still using all of your mana, even though you're not playing a 3-drop. You might not play a 3-drop on 3, but you play a 1-drop and a 2-drop on 3. Hand 2 over here is the same amount of lands, but it's got a Molten Collapse, a Third Path Iconoclast, a Counterspell, and an Expressive Iteration. And this is very awkward because everything's 2 CMC, so obviously you're missing your first, you're missing your ability to spend mana on turn 1. But you also have an awkward decision on turn 2, because if your opponent has developed something you want to destroy, you're probably playing Molten Collapse, which leaves you unable to develop a threat or hold up a counterspell. If you want to develop a threat, you can't use a removal spell or hold up a counterspell. If you want to hold up a counterspell, you can't develop your threats or remove a threat. And Expressive Iteration, even though it is a 2-drop, is better on turn 3 because you want to be able to maximize the ability to get a land off of it and make it a card advantage spell instead of card selection. So if you look at these two hands, though, pound for pound, each of these cards in this bottom hand are probably stronger than the ones in this top hand. I mean, you could say Bowmasters is maybe stronger than Third Path Iconoclast, but Counterspell is a lot better than Mana Leak. It gets rid of anything, it's not conditional, it's, if your opponent for some reason has excess amounts of mana, Counterspell is really good. Molten Collapse, again, kills anything, any creature, any planeswalker. Expressive Iteration is a much stronger card advantage spell than Opt is. But you can't just have only these more expensive, quote-unquote more expensive spells. You got to have a mixture, because that way you can fill your curve more easily. And this is especially important for decks that are more reactive, because when you're proactive, you want to curve out, 1, 2, 3, whatever. But when you're reactive, you want to be able to answer your opponent's game plan and progress your own, which means you got to be flexible. You can't have a whole bunch of cards that prevent you from double spelling. Okay, so that's the basics of mana advantage. Let's talk about the ways that you can try to optimize spending your mana every turn. So the first way you can try to optimize it is by focusing on perfect short-term mana usage. And what this means is that you play a lot of low-cost spells, a lot of 1s and 2s, because it's very easy to fill holes in your curve with combinations of 1s and 2-drops. If you've got a hand that looks like this, Mountain, 3 1-drops, 2 2-drops, you're probably going to be able to use all of your mana every single turn because you have a bunch of cheap spells that can fit whatever you want on the curve. But one of the issues of choosing this method of optimization is that over the course of a longer game, you can run out of cards to use in your hand. You're going to deploy all of your spells really quickly because they're very cheap, so you're going to run out of cards in hand. And, you take this hand here, if you add 2 more lands to it, if the next 2 draws are lands, you're going to start running out of ability to use all of your mana every turn because you're going to have 3, 4 mana, which means you need 3, 4 cards to be able to fill up, your total mana usage for the turn. Also, 1 and 2-drops tend to get outclassed as the game goes on. So this idea of maximizing your perfect amount of mana, using all of your mana every single turn, usually only works for decks that are trying to be very aggressive and end the game quickly, so they don't want the game to drag on. or in decks that have a lot of cantripping effects, because those cantripping effects and card advantage spells will give you more cards so that you will always have more things to fill your curve. You're not going to run out of cards if every card you play replaces itself. So when you want to optimize perfect short-term mana usage, you have a lot of 1s and 2s, and you cut most of your 3s, you cut pretty much all of your 4s. You just want to be really lean and low to the ground. Another way that you can optimize your mana advantage is by looking at maximizing the average mana used across time. And the way that this works is that you want a wider spread of spells so that you have a better chance of using all of your mana every turn as the game goes on. Usually that means that you're cutting away at some of your 1-drops, because the 1-drops are only desirable really early in the game, and if we're going to be honest, not doing something on turn 1 is not the end of the world because you only have 1 mana to spend. It's much worse to not spend your mana when you have 2 or 3 mana open than it is to not spend your mana when you only have 1 mana open. This means that you shift away from 1-drops and look more towards 2s and 3s, because you want to be able to have enough cards to last you throughout the game and still use as much mana as you can. So the reason why this is average mana usage across time is that across the course of the game, the average mana that you use will be higher. You might not have as many perfect turns, but you'll have more turns that are optimized. The curve should be more spread out, but it's still sort of left shifted. You're not going to have a curve that's centered on 3-drops. It's going to be centered on probably 2-drops, with more 3-drops than you would see trying to optimize for a perfect mana curve. And you might still have some 4-drops, but you're going to have a lot fewer 4-drops than some of the other strategies. And this sort of strategy is best used for decks that are looking to play sort of a medium-length game while still having a velocity of spells. They're not trying to play only 1 spell a turn, they're trying to double spell pretty actively, but they also want the game to go long. So you balance your mana values with some strength of spells. You play a lot of 2s, a lot of 3s, fewer 1s and 4s. A third way of optimizing mana advantage is to focus on card strength over time. And the way that this works is that ideally you play the most expensive card you can every single turn of the game. Usually cards that cost more are stronger than cards that cost less. A 4-drop is stronger than a 3-drop, which is stronger than a 2-drop. And so the idea is that you want to play the most expensive card at every single point in the game. So, a hand like this is mountain, mountain, mountain. I've got a 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. And obviously if you draw a mountain, you got a 4-drop that you can play on turn 4. And the idea is that this is a lot stronger than playing 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 2-drop, 2-drop, because your 4-drop is probably better than 2 2s. You do have to have the caveat that depending on the speed of the format, and Canadian Highlander is a pretty fast format, you can't just fill your deck with a lot of 4s and 5s. You do have to compress your curve a little bit, but the way that this sort of presents itself in terms of curve shape is that curves with this metric, optimizing this metric, are centered around a specific mana value and then are kind of flat. So if you say, I'm going to focus around 3-drops, I'm going to have the most 3s, and then I'm going to have a few less 2s. I'm going to have less 2s than 3s, but not that much less 2s. I'm going to have less 4s than 3s, but not that many fewer 4s. And then I'm going to have, a lot fewer 1s, a lot fewer 5s. This is best for used for decks that really want to proactively curve out every single game and deploy the strongest threat on board every turn to outmuscle their opponent, and are not so concerned about double spelling. They just want to keep slamming haymakers every turn. Sort of the last way that you can optimize mana advantage is by jumping the curve. And this is most obvious in green decks with mana dorks, because the way that it works is that you use acceleration to be able to produce more mana than you would just by playing 1 land drop every turn. And that lets you leverage your increased mana to play costlier effects because they come out faster and they come out more consistently because you have more mana over the course of the game. So, if you've got a hand that's 3 forests, land elves, a 3-drop, a 3-drop, a 4-drop, you don't need a 2-drop because you're skipping from 1. You play land elves on 1, and then turn 2 you've got 3 mana. Turn 4 you've got, or turn 3 you've got 4 mana. Turn 4 you've got 4 mana. Even if you don't draw another land. Even if you miss your land drop, you go forest, land elves, 3-drop, forest, 4-drop. And if this were 2 mana, you could still, it's still easier to hit the higher thresholds because you have more mana in your deck, even if that mana is part of your 1-drop slot or your 2-drop slot. Decks that are trying to use this strategy try to skip the mana values that are made redundant by the acceleration. So most of the time in this format, you'll see things like decks with a lot of mana dorks. They put a mana dork on 1, it produces 1 mana, so that means that you're going from 1 to 3, which means you can skip 2 drops. If you've got a deck with a lot of 2 mana rocks, like talismans and signets, they produce 1 mana on 2, so you need fewer 3 drops in your curve. And you can go a little bit further with this. Sometimes you'll go 1 to 3 to 5, so maybe you'll have fewer 4 drops. That's usually not the case, just because you need to compress your curve enough because of the speed of the format, but it's something to think about. So really, you build around accelerated breakpoints. You say, where's my acceleration on my curve, and what does that jump me to? I want to emphasize that part of my curve instead of focusing on 1, 2, 3, 4, a perfect curve. So those are sort of the 4 methods of optimization. And in graphical form, this is kind of what the curves look like. So these concepts I got from this article called Limiting Chance Mana Curves by Dan Nelson. And it's mostly focused on a limited environment, which means you don't really have a jumping the curve deck in limited, because usually you're not playing like a ramp deck in limited. But the idea is that if you want to focus on maximizing your early mana, or you have a lot of cantrips, so you're going to constantly replace your cards and you want maximum flexibility, you're going to look at this perfect mana curve. You're going to have a lot of 1s, you're going to have a lot of 2s, and then you're going to sharply drop off with maybe some 3s and very few 4s, if any. For average mana, when you want to use the most amount of mana over the course of the game, you're going to have a lot fewer 1s, because you're okay missing the 1-drop slot, but you wouldn't mind having them once in a while. You're going to have a lot of 2s, because 2s are pretty good at filling curves, but also are a lot stronger. And then you're going to slowly taper off. So you're going to have fewer 3s, fewer 4s, and maybe a few 5s. But you're not going to sharply drop off like with this perfect mana curve, you're going to slowly drop off. When you want to maximize the strength of every card that you play, your curve is going to be very flat looking. And it might not even look very flat. It might be, sort of a bell shape, but you're going to have a center that you're looking at. So in this case, this one is centered at 3, which means you're going to have fewer 2s, fewer 4s, but not that many fewer. You're going to have a lot fewer 1s, a lot fewer 5s. Basically, the further you get from your center, the fewer spells you should have along that curve. Because the idea is that on turn 1, you want to play 1-drop, on turn 2, you want to play 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, etc. And you would rather not draw you'd rather not draw these higher pieces because they get stuck in your hand, but you'd rather not draw these lower pieces because they're not as good late game, so you focus on one specific area. And then for jumping the curve, you get this sort of double hill shape, where you're going to have a lot of your acceleration based at one level. You're going to not have many cards at the spot that you're trying to skip, and you're going to have a lot of cards at the spot that goes directly across from your acceleration, and then you're going to dip down some more, because you really want to maximize your ability to go, to play your lands, play your acceleration, and go straight into a thing that benefits immediately off of your acceleration. You don't want to have to wait an additional turn to then make use of the accelerated mana. So these are just sort of broad curves. Almost no deck looks exactly like any of these curves, but I want these shapes to be something that you think about. When you look at a curve, you should say, well, am I looking to play a lot of spells all the time? My curve should start high on low drops and dip severely. If I want to play sort of a medium-long game, it should, start maybe a little lower, go up and peak, and then taper off slowly. If I want to play a deck that maximizes the strength of the cards that I'm playing every turn, I want to, start low and ramp up until I hit my midway point, and then, slowly curve out, go down from there. And then obviously if I'm jumping the curve, it's very obvious that I'm jumping from the place that I accelerate to the place I'm accelerating to. Okay, so now let's start examining some mana curves in winning Canadian Highlander decks. The decks that are in my data are winning lists from Canadian Highlander events. They're all from the Canadian Highlander Winners Archive Moxfield page. And I'm going to look at some aggro decks broken down into non-soul mana aggro decks and soul mana aggro decks, and then some mid-range decks and some control/tempo decks. I've excluded combo decks from this video because combo decks really have unique requirements. They're not really looking to accrue value over time. They're looking to assemble their combo and win the game, which means that they don't really follow, they don't really have any interest in following a specific curve or playing the mana advantage game. They're not worried about, generating value with their 1-drops over time, their 2-drops over time. They're just looking to get everything that comes together and wins immediately. They don't need to spend time accruing value. Some expectations about the data. Canadian Highlander is a format with a vintage card pool and 100-card singleton, which creates a pretty unique environment. The format is relatively fast. Curves are going to mostly stop at 4. This is because Canadian Highlander really is sort of a turn 4 to 5 format based on the goldfish speed of aggro decks and combo decks. Most fast combo decks are trying to goldfish you by turn 4. Most fast aggro decks are trying to goldfish you by turn 5. This means that you really need to be interacting and affecting the game state in these early turns, which means you're not going to have time to, try and hardcast 5-drops or hardcast 6-drops without, lots of acceleration. So curves are mostly going to stop at 4. There might be some 5-drops, but, obviously you can't play a 5-drop on turn 5 if the game is already over. I also would expect there to be a bunch of natural compression and early tapering. It's going back to the whole, it's a turn 4 to 5 format. Whereas the sample curves kind of went from turn 1 to turn 5, mana cost 1 to mana cost 5 that I showed you, I would expect most curves to sort of shrink into the 1 to 4, 1 to 3.5 range. And I'd expect there to be a lot fewer higher drops because you just can't afford to have expensive cards stuck in your hand in this format. So you're willing to take a little bit of a hit to the strength of your individual cards if you can deploy things earlier. And there's some really high power level spikes that are created by pointed cards that encourage min-maxing your early game strength over long-term stability. And then some assumptions that I made for calculating these curves. Curves start at CMC 0. This is because there's a lot of free interaction in the format, a lot of free acceleration, and so it's pretty likely that most decks are going to have 5 to 10 pieces of free interaction, which is a significant portion of the curve. Free spells don't really contribute to mana advantage in the same way because they don't cost mana, they're not really contributing mana. And most free spells happen to be interaction or acceleration, but I think that it's worth seeing how many free spells are in a given deck. Spells that are pitch spells or discounted will differ from their printed cost. So, for example, forces are all set to 0. Stuff like Fury and Solitude is set to 0. Leyline Binding, I said it's normally costs 6, but it's going to be reduced by domain most of the time, so I set it to 2 usually, because most of the decks that play Leyline Binding are 4-color. Delve spells, I assumed were, you were able to delve the full amount in most cases. So yeah, there's a lot of spells that are played in this format that look like they cost a lot, but in actuality don't really cost very much at all. And then for stuff like X spells or spells that you intend to cheat out, I picked what I thought were reasonable expected values of X or the cost to cheat them out. So, for example, something like March of Otherworldly Light is X and a white, and I let that stay at CMC 1 because it often gets used for snagging Moxen or Urza Saga. Sometimes you'll cast it for 1 for hitting a mana dork, but it's going to be able to be cast at X equals 0 quite a lot. Same with Prismatic Ending. But something like Green Sun Zenith, you're almost never going to cast it at X equals 0 because almost no deck runs Dryad Arbor. Green Sun Zenith I usually set for X equals 1 because most of the decks that include Green Sun Zenith include mana dorks, and that's going to be sort of its most common use case is to just get an early mana dork, with obviously being able to be flexible to get more expensive things later in the game. Stuff that is meant to be cheated in, like natural order targets or Cauldra, I set to whatever the expected cost it is to cheat them in. So a natural order target costs 4 because it's basically going to be, it's expected to be cheated in via natural order. Cauldra is normally a 7-drop, but most of the time it's being cheated in by Stoneforge Mystic, so I set it as 3. These are all just little things. There's a lot of different ways you can choose to account for cards that have alternate costs. These are just the ones that I've chosen. All right, let's get into decks. Starting with non-soul mana aggro decks. So I've chosen Red Green Blitz, Mardu Tokens, 4-color Winota, and Red Deck Winds for the non-soul mana aggro decks. Red Deck Wins and Red Green Blitz are both trying to use a lot of early creatures and a lot of burn in the case of Red Deck Wins, or pump spells to end the game very quickly and just operate on maximum efficiency for the first 3 to 4 turns of the game. This means that they really emphasize the perfect mana in the early stages of the game, so they've got a lot of 1-drops, some 2-drops, and then sharply drop off. Red Deck Wins only has 3 3-drops and no 4-drops, and Red Green Blitz has 7 3-drops and 1 4-drop, partially because Red Green Blitz is a 2-color deck, so it has to play a few more lands, which means it has more mana, so it's able to use some later, some higher cost threats, but they still both emphasize this perfect mana curve of start high and drop off dramatically very quickly. Mardu Tokens is a deck that has a lot of interaction on 1, a lot of one-shot token makers on 2, a lot of engine pieces on 3, and then some individual standalone threats on 4. So really, what Mardu Tokens is trying to do is it's trying to maximize the average amount of mana it uses over the course of the game. It's okay going to turn 5, 6, 7, etc., because it's got cards at various points in the curve in order to maximize its mana usage. But it's not trying to play a 2-drop on 2, a 3-drop on 3, a 4-drop on 4, a 5-drop on 5. It's okay playing, 2 2-drops on 4, a 2-drop and a 3-drop on 5, that sort of thing. 4-color Winota is a mana dork deck, which means that it's naturally going to jump the curve from 1 to 3 a little bit, but it doesn't have acceleration as such a key part of its plan that it completely ignores the 2-drop slot. So 4-color Winota is sort of a hybrid between jumping the curve and trying to maximize strength of your cards at every point in the curve, and it's sort of centered around 3-drops. So, you want to accelerate into 3-drops, but if you don't accelerate into 3-drops, you're okay playing 2-drops or playing a couple 2-drops instead of a 4-drop. And so there's sort of a higher density of 4s, a higher density of 2s than you would expect from a deck that is purely jumping the curve, but it's also not just trying to average the mana out, because normally you wouldn't peak at 3 if you're just trying to play sort of the average mana game. So let's talk about soul mana aggro decks. The decks I've chosen are Shmedium Red, Death and Taxes, Gruul Monsters, and Medium Red. So Shmedium Red is a deck that plays Mana Crypt, plays Ancient Tombs, City of Traders, that sort of thing. But it's also not a deck that consistently is able to jump the curve, because it's not playing a bunch of mana dorks or whatever. It's just something that is able to utilize higher thresholds of mana without guaranteeing that it can jump the curve. So really, Shmedium Red is trying to focus on maximizing the strength of its draws, of its cards at every step of the way, and it focuses mostly on 2-drops. It's centered on 2-drops. So it's a little bit of a sharper curve than the one that we saw in the sample curves, but you play a lot of 2-drops, and then you do fewer 1-drops and 3-drops on either side of the curve, and then you dip off a lot more for 4-drops. It stops at 4. But it's not really trying to play perfect. I always want a 1-drop on 1. I'm pretty much always going to have a 2-drop on 2, but it's not trying to go 1-drop, 2-drop, 1-drop plus 2-drop. It's trying to go maybe a 1-drop, definitely a 2-drop on 2, definitely a 3-drop on 3, and then either a 4-drop on 4 or 2 2-drops on 4. Death and Taxes, on the other hand, is a deck that usually has a lot of 1-mana 2/1s for early pressure to build into the human theme, and it also has a lot of utility pieces such as Mother of Runes or Giver of Runes. So its 1-drop slot is very packed, and then it has a lot of 2-drops because it is an Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, Mana Crypt deck, much like Shmedium Red. But it's looking to mostly deploy a lot of 1s and 2s early on, and then it sort of dips off for 3-drops and for 4-drops. It's not as extreme as RDW, where RDW had like 35 1-drops or whatever, but it really does want to use perfect mana for the first 2 to 3 turns of the game, and then afterwards it lets its acceleration take over to try and play haymakers in terms of 3-drops. Gruul Monsters is a classic acceleration deck. It's just trying to jump the curve. It plays a ton of acceleration on 1, mostly mana dorks, a little bit of removal, and then it tries to ignore 2 for the most part. These are mostly utility creatures or creatures that scale, like Moloch. Moloch's a 2-drop, but also it can be anything because it's an X spell. and then it wants to go straight to 3-drops and just kind of slam 3-drops for most of the game. It plays a higher level of 4-drops because it's going to have a higher average level of mana over the course of the game, but it really is trying to maximize the curve of 1-drop acceleration into 3-drop threat. And then medium red is a slower deck because it goes up to 5-drops and some 4-drops, but because it doesn't have the same level of acceleration that something like Rule Monsters does, it doesn't have the all the mana dorks, it can't guarantee that it's going to jump from 1 to 3 or jump from 2 to 4. So over the course of the game, it wants to maximize the strength that it has at each step of the way and use sort of the most mana over the course of the game. So it's going to have this sort of curve where it sort of peaks at 2.5, 3, and then it's going to taper off a little bit harder than perfect strength because the format's just too fast. You can't slowly taper off and play 12 4-drops, 8 5-drops, or whatever. You have to cut down pretty quickly once you get to the 4 and 5-drop range. But it really is trying to play the most powerful thing at each step of the curve, and hopefully it accelerates into them as opposed to having to wait till turn 5 to cast its 5-drops. Okay, let's talk about some mid-range decks. I've chosen 5. I've chosen Omnath Initiative, Jeskai Midrange, Jund Midrange, Rakdos Midrange, and Sultai Midrange. So Omnath Initiative is a 4-color deck that has triple Mox, it has a bunch of mana dorks in it, and it's really looking to play Haymaker 3 and 4-drops over the course of the game. Which means that, in a sense, it kind of jumps the curve. It's not doing quite a severe dip where it doesn't play any 2-drops, but it really is trying to go from 1 to 3 and skip 2 in between. It just recognizes that since it's not all in like Rule Monsters is, it plays a lot more interaction, a lot more stuff. It's okay playing some 2-drops over the course of the game. It's sort of a mixture between the average mana over the course of the game and the jumping the curve curves. Jund Midrange, this particular version of Jund Midrange is very similar. It also plays a bunch of mana dorks and is trying to play a bunch of 3s and 4s. And so their curves are very similar. They're trying to jump from 1 to 3, but they're content playing some 2-drops if they have to. If they get to 4 mana and have to play 2-2-drops, that's not a big deal. Jeskai Midrange doesn't play. This Jeskai Midrange deck doesn't play any acceleration and instead plays a bunch of cantrips, which means that it really wants to have a lot of mana to use early on turn 1, and some mana to use on turn 2, and play a lot of 1s and 2s to fill out its curve and hopefully stick a 3-drop or 4-drop later in the game. This is kind of like a less extreme version of the perfect mana, trying to maximize perfect mana, because the cantrips will keep drawing you gas, which means that you just want to have velocity, which means you need a lot of low drops in order to keep casting spells over the course of the game and hopefully stick something strong later in the game. The Rakdos midrange deck plays some acceleration. It's playing things like Ancient Tomb, Soul Ring, 2 Moxen, I think it's on Chrome Mox, Deathrite Shaman, Ragavan. But it's really looking to sort of play the long game. So it's got a lot of 1-drops because that's where a lot of the best interaction is. But it's really just trying to play 2-drops for the most part. A lot of 2-drops, a lot of 3-drops, and then it's going to slowly taper off to 4s and 5s because it's trying to use as much mana proactively over the course of the game, and that often involves using, deploying a 2-drop and spending 2 removal spells, or deploying a 3-drop and spending a removal spell. It's not looking to accelerate necessarily or jump any sort of curves. It's just trying to say, I want a 1-drop on 1, a 2-drop on 2, etc. It really wants to curve out. Finally, Sultai midrange is very similar. There's not that much acceleration. It's triple Mox and Deathrite Shaman, I think. But it's also got a lot of cantrips to smooth out its draws, so it has a lot of early plays to keep itself consistent and smooth. Play some more 2-drops, play some 3-drops, and sort of curve out until it hits 4, where it sort of stops. Finally, let's look at blue control and tempo decks. So the 5 decks I've chosen are Jeskai Control, Check Midrange, Jeskai Green Control, and then sort of a Grixis, blue, red, black tempo list, and an Izzet tempo list. So the tempo lists, Izzet and blue, red, black, are really just trying to land an early threat, use a ton of cantrips for card selection, and a lot of really cheap interaction, 4 spikes, spell pierces, 2 mana counter spells, etc., and just get over the finish line that way. So they're really low to the ground, they're very lean decks, and they really emphasize on flexibility of mana, So they've got a lot of 1s, a lot of 2s, and sharp taper off into 3-drops, and no 4s. Check Midrange is kind of similar. It's also, this particular build is also pretty low to the ground, but it's also willing to go a little bit long, so it's got a few more mana sinks in terms of 3-drops and 4-drops, but it's still trying to play the hyper-interactive plan with a lot of 1s and 2s for cantrips and smoothing. Both Jeskai and Jeskai Green are very similar to each other. They have a lot of 1-drops because they're playing all the cantrips, and they also are playing all the most efficient interaction in the format, which are all on 1s. But then they're going to drop off to get some 2-drops, a lot of counter spells and card advantage spells at 2, and even a lot of threats like Pyromancers, perhaps. 3-drops are where most of the flash threats sit, which gives them some flexibility, because if they don't use a flash threat, they can play, a counter spell and a cantrip. And then later on, they have some haymakers at 4 and 5. So really, most of these blue decks are trying to, they really embody the perfect mana curve, the perfect mana philosophy, because they want to be flexible. You have to be able to interact cheaply while also deploying threats cheaply, which means you just don't have time to tap out for 3s or 4s or 5s. All right. Let's talk about how acceleration, cantrips, mana sinks, and utility lands affect your mana curve. So obviously, when you're jumping the curve, acceleration is very useful for jumping the curve. But acceleration also increases the overall mana that's in your deck, which can change the requirements needed for your curve. So, something like that's the difference between RDW and Shmedium Red is that Shmedium Red plays Ancient Tomb, Mana Crypt, City of Traders, etc. And that doesn't necessarily, and it also plays, a few more lands. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's guaranteed to accelerate ahead, but the overall density of mana means that the curve can be pushed higher. It can be pushed into a different direction. Cantrips, like Ponder, or even things that replace themselves, Baleful Strix, Impulse, that sort of thing, tend to occupy the lower slot on your curves, and they make your mana more smooth, which means you need to run a different amount of lands. But they also are really good at making it so that you can maximize the amount of mana you spend every turn. If you always have cantrips, then you've got a bunch of 1-drops that are going to let you use little excess bits of mana, but they're also going to find you more lands to maximize, the amount of mana you generate. Or they're going to find you spells to use for all the lands that you have to maximize the mana that you're spending. So cantrips affect your curve pretty dramatically, usually by lowering it quite a bit, because you don't need to ensure that you have the perfect 3-drop for your turn 3 or perfect 4-drop for turn 4. You're going to be able to go and find the cards that you need when you need them. There are a lot of mana sinks that you can include in a deck, things like Den of the Bugbear, Urza Saga, Sentinel of the Nameless City, and mana sinks are really good for optimizing the amount of mana that you spend, and they can be hidden from your mana curve. There are things that are not immediately obvious, like Den of the Bugbear is not going to show up in your mana curve because it's a land. Sentinel of the Nameless City, it's a 3-drop, but it's every time it enters when it enters the battlefield and every time it attacks, it's giving you something that basically lets you use excess bits of 1 mana, all along your curve, and that's not something that you can see just by looking at a curve. Then also there are utility lands, so things like the Horizon lands, Wasteland, Meticulous Archive. They can be really powerful for increasing consistency, but they can also disrupt your curve. So things like Surveil lands are really powerful for consistency, but if you play a tapped land, that's a land that you're not going to be able to use for your turn. So you're going to be basically taking a turn off and missing that key point on your curve. They're usually worth including anyway. Things like Fiery Islet, the Horizon lands, beyond just hurting you, when you cash them in, they're really good for preventing you from flooding out because you can cash them in for more cards, but you are reducing the amount of mana that you have available to you. So you are basically putting yourself down on the curve again, which means that if you're going to be using a lot of Horizon lands, you either need to have a lot of acceleration so you have excess mana, or you just need to think about what your curve is like, because if you have a lot of high drops, you're probably never going to want to crack your Horizon lands because you're going to want all that mana. And in stuff like Wasteland, in a lot of decks that have higher curves, Wasteland can just count as a normal land. But in something like Red Deck Winds, Wasteland doesn't cast like 50 to 70% of your spells, so it doesn't really help you with your curve. If your hand is mountain, mountain, and all red spells, you're great in RDW. If your hand is mountain, wasteland, all red spells, you might have trouble. Also, much like the Horizon lands, when you crack your wasteland, you are giving up some of your own mana, which is setting you back on your own curve. Mana bases are like a very complicated topic. You could spend a lot of time talking about them and thinking about them. I really recommend this article that Kelvin in the Discord put together, how to build a mana base for singleton formats. It's basically tailor-made for Highlander, and it's a really great read if you're interested in this sort of thing. So let's wrap everything up. Starting with a summary of the trends that we saw with archetypes. Blue control and tempo decks and mid-range decks tend to prefer curves that promote perfect mana and that fill the holes in your curves in order to be able to interact with their opponents while also progressing their own game plans. This means a lot of cheap cantrips, cheap interaction, cheap counterspells, and cheap threats, because it's easier to deploy a 2-mana threat while holding up 2 mana for a counterspell than it is to deploy a 4-mana threat and hold up 2 mana for a counterspell. Decks with mana dorks tend to hit the threshold for the amount of acceleration to naturally align with jumping the curve. They really want to jump the curve, take advantage of the extra mana that their acceleration is giving them, and they tend to focus on curves that leverage the ability to maximize the amount of mana that they spend over the course of the game. They're not so concerned about having perfect mana early game. They just want to spend the most amount of mana over the course of an elongated game. Quick aggro decks like RDW or Blitz, they tend to emphasize perfect mana because they're eschewing individual card strength while trying to just basically kill their opponent before they have a chance to react. They're deploying a lot of 1s and 2 drops in the hope that they can just overwhelm their opponent very quickly, and they're hoping to outrace the sort of bigger value-oriented cards that other decks might play. Bigger aggro and slower mid-range decks tend to sort of do the opposite. Rather than trying to get the perfect amount of mana used on turns 1 and 2 and 3, they want to use the most amount of mana over the course of the game, so they're trying to, play 2 drops, 3 drops, 4 drops, and maximize the strength of their cards at every step of the way. The thing I want to conclude with is the mana curve is just a tool in the toolbox. It's not, a strict law to follow. The shape of your curve matters a lot more than the exact numbers. The mana curve is really best used as a guideline, and if your deck is not working, you should look at it and look at the mana curve, and that might be able to help diagnose what's wrong with your deck. But I do recommend staying away from looking at it as, I need exactly this many 1 drops, exactly this many 2 drops, exactly this many 3 drops, because at the end of the day, if you fudge the numbers a little bit, you play 1 less 2 drop than you're supposed to play, or you play 2 less 2 drops and 2 more 3 drops than you're supposed to play, it's probably not going to matter. And you really do want to have your deck function as best as it can, both from a numbers perspective, but also from a card quality perspective. In theory, you could have a perfect curve by playing all 1 drops. But if you try to play all 1 drops, your card quality is going to diminish pretty severely. You're going to start reaching for like 1 mana 1/1s and that sort of thing. So you really want to use this as a guideline, and you want the shape to look healthy. You don't necessarily need it to be a numbers game, which is why I didn't really emphasize specific numbers. I just tried to emphasize the shapes of the curves in this video. So that's all I really wanted to say about mana curves. Most people know the basic, theory about mana curves, but I think that it's a little bit deeper than that, and it's a tool. It's a useful tool that you can use for deck building and sort of evaluating how decks in the format work. Thank you for watching the video. I hope that was helpful. If you're interested in more content, check out either the playlists down below. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section, and I'll be sure to answer them. Have a great day. Thank you for watching the video again. See you next time.